humanity today, perhaps in other time periods as well, long past, but today human beings have this strong appreciation for, desire for, hyperarousal, emotions that deal with hyperarousal, hyper intense emotions. It's not just intense states of exhilaration, some type of a rapture, some type of a intense, powerful, joyful state only. But in the case of fear, in the case of terror, anxiety, tension, pressure, uncertainty, all these have within them the spectrum of hypo to all the way to hyper. The gradient is quite vast for each. There's a range. However, human beings today are mostly fascinated by the last gradient, or the last portion of the range or the spectrum of that particular emotion, it seems. So we have become fixated on the extremes of emotions. That's what I mean by hyperarousal. So when a person is getting sad or experiencing some symptoms of sadness, or something happened to them, they're going to the deep end. And then they're looking for the opposite, its counterpart, which is extreme joy. Extreme, well, whatever the opposite is represented as, that's what they want, to cut themselves loose. In psychology, it's called all or nothing thinking. If this doesn't happen, it's doom and gloom for me, type of a scenario. I'm all in or I'm busted, basically. I'm all in and I better win the whole thing. Otherwise, I don't mind going broke. That mentality. So we're a culture of extremes. We become a culture of extremes. Thinking that that's what life is all about. People are pushing themselves into uncomfortable areas of how much they can tolerate. Initially, 40, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, it was about how much immorality can my family, can my culture, can my loved ones tolerate coming from me. Pushing and pushing and pushing. Pushing the boundaries is another way of explaining that, or, suggesting this, or explaining this. Today you have individuals, not just some, but the whole, everywhere things are overpriced, especially in places like the United States, Europe. United States is really taken off, and unfortunately for the last several years. People are really struggling to live, to survive. Millions of people are on the streets. Not just in the United States. You see that also in Europe. And when you look at it, the situations really closely, there's a pattern. There's different things going on. You have on one side the greed of those in power, but it's not just one-sided, the greed of one particular people, and that's it. No, it has to fall on some other people. My greed will have an impact on you who doesn't have a greed, or in their heart, who doesn't have those tendencies, greed-driven tendencies. Nevertheless, if I am in a position where I can employ certain things, I can have some power over you, that's going to have an impact on you. Even though it might not have any negative connotations. But what drives a person to impose their will upon someone else? To the other person's detriment, and eventually, karmically speaking, upon me, the person who is utilizing their resources to squash someone else, destroy another person's rights. I have to give up, I have to relinquish some of my values. I have to suppress my humanity. And I have to emphasize the rewards of something else. So basically, I have to numb myself. This is when a person today who happens to have some, I just gave the example of somebody in a position of power, using it or abusing it to the detriment of others. But it could be somebody who's just, you don't have that role, let's say. However, you do have capacities, you do have time, which is your biggest asset. You have your body. Let's say you're healthy. You have a healthy mind, relatively speaking. You have some abilities. Or maybe you even have some money in the bank. Or some credit, or a credit line. To be overrun by certain desires, influenced by the world around you, allowing yourself to get into those ranges of hyperarousal, as I was mentioning. If you don't have a proper compass, a personal ethical principle, something that you consider to be holy, something that you consider to be of value beyond the mundane, if you don't have such a gauge, you will not think about the other person. You will not think about as to what happens after this hyperarousal state is over, because every such state, it will be over. And something else will show up. This is called change. Now, hyperarousal gives you the false promise of gratification. So we are addicted to this state of hyperarousal, but it's run by ignorance. The willful ignoring of the fact that things will change. Now, once things change, that hyper-aroused, that intense joy, intense, even the opposite, depressed state, sad state, or anxiety state, it's not always like that. It never is 100% of the time, 24/7. There are breaks in between. when we approach it like that, we become a little bit more human. We come out of the movie in our mind. We start to look at not just the action itself, but we look at the consequences of the actions. This is key to understand karma or kamma. This is when the person says, well, today I have the power to enforce upon others, but it's not going to stay like that. This is what Lord Buddha talks about, perception of impermanence. Perception of impermanence. Perception is not an idea. It's a fact. It's a clear understanding of a principle. In this case, the principle of impermanence. Nothing is permanent, including this emotion that I'm going through, or what I am seeking after. That's why a person who is caught into the addictive cycle of constantly wanting to be high, they want to disprove the fact that there is impermanence. A heroin addict or any kind of an addict like that, what they're doing is they want to stay there. They want that high. Re-experiencing that high. Such a person is in a deluded state because they are ignoring the very fact that nothing lasts. However, it's not just that. It's the consequence of the action they were engaged in, which is extremely important to consider. So today's culture, human beings, we are ignoring that consequential part of our actions. We are fixated on the action itself, in the absence of, as if it's like in a vacuum. But who does this? There are other human beings who undergo this. Children, infants, who, if you notice them, if you observe them closely, playing this and that initially in their initial part of their lives, primary years of their lives, unless they get some discipline, unless they get some guidance by adults, caring, well-meaning, a good head above their shoulder type of adults, and a good heart in their hearts, in their chests type of adults, with responsibility and awareness of social norms and values, in the presence of such adult caregivers, the child is going to be shown the parameters as to how far they can go, what they're allowed to do, what they're not allowed to do. Why? Because there are consequences to themselves and to the environment around them. But we learn and we grow out of that, hopefully. But what I'm describing here is the fact that many of us are not. In fact, we're going back to that narcissistic way of looking at things, of wanting to gain things, to experience things. And that is a very unhealthy state to be in. You look at celebrities. You look at, people with tremendous resources and, power, etc. Upper echelons of society. And when you see how they behave, they come back and they say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't, etc." But the person has relinquished their executive power of the brain. The prefrontal cortex isn't working. or at least, that's, by the way, the prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobes of your brain, which distinguishes us from other animals. It is also the big player, the big, it's called executive because it is using something, not to abuse other human beings. That's not why we have the prefrontal cortex. So that I can manipulate you, I can take away your resources, I can enslave you, I can outsmart you in the, I don't know, stock market. I can take away your money, your wealth, your family. I can beat the system type of a thing. That's not why we have the prefrontal cortex. It is there to establish the understanding of wisely applied ethical standards. This comes to us over millions of years of chiseling, of shaping literally our brain through the interactions that we've been having with each other human beings, the social structures that came about, the differences between men and women, the functions that each of us have. So the physical structure has everything to do with the function. This is something basic that you learn in biology even, 101. The shape of the cell says to you the function of the cell, and vice versa. So we today are somehow trying to change all that simply because we have the dream or we have the desire or the intention that it's like that child, narcissistic child playing, at the kids' playground, in the sandbox, saying, no, I want this. I'll go to class whenever I want to. I will take away his toy and I will be allowed to do that. And you're going to have to live with it. That's living in the hyperarousal, trying to get what you want. That's a person who is simply refusing to see the reality of impermanence and things changing, because tomorrow it will be someone else trying to take what I have. To take what I cherish from me. But that turns it into the law of the jungle type of a thing. But that's not what we're about, human beings. That's not why we have been evolving into. So there's that aspect of looking at emotions not as the end in all, end all type of a thing. Now, in connection to the Buddhist the Buddhist principles and the teachings, specifically the goal of what the teachings are trying to take us to experience, which is Nibbana, freedom from suffering. What we need to appreciate is also the fact that without joy there is no Nibbana. There cannot be. The path to Nibbana is not strewn, it's not covered up, flowered with gloomy states of mind, of depressive states, emotional upheavals like that. That's a telltale sign that you're on the wrong path. So even though I was mentioning the pitfalls of seeking extreme emotions, there is a state that is, I like to call it silent joy. Lord Buddha had even a better term, santutti, which is contentment, serene contentment. There's a joy in there. The heart is Yes, jubilant, but not to the point where it creates anxiety. There is no agitation in the heart or mind as a result of that joy. There's a peacefulness on the surface of the water, as it were. Because when your mind is excited, you'll make mistakes. You won't see clearly. You will become fixated on what you want. You won't see the impact of what it is that you want, the impact of those things upon the world around you. So it lends you to become more selfish. And it has nothing to do with the path. So there is no nibbana without joy. That's one. There's ownership of our actions, specifically the consequences of our actions, which then necessitates for us to pause for a few moments and look at the emotional rewards that we're seeking. Because today's infantile culture, it's infantile. Human beings, adult human beings, seeking to experience infantile emotions at the cost of someone else. That's what makes it infantile. Not the seeking of joy and happiness. That's not why I'm calling it infantile. Infantile specifically in reference to narcissistic tendencies, where it's all about you and what you're getting out of this at the cost of others' happiness. So there isn't any sense of altruism, there isn't any sense of compassion there. The narcissist is not compassionate. It's impossible. It's all about me, 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 me. A narcissist will never ultimately be looking for self-sacrifice, in a sense. They worship only at their own altar, to themselves, at the cost of others. And that's the culture we have. Versus a person who says, no, hold on. I need to be responsible with my intentions. This thing that I'm seeking, is this going to have an impact on you over there? And then you hold back. This is what we call sangvara, which is restraint. Restraint. Now, what do we do with violent, wild animals? We lock them up. Or at least we lock ourselves in. If we're somewhere in the Serengeti or in a jungle, the first thing you do is you close yourself in an enclosure. You put yourself in an enclosure. Build up high walls and fences so that nothing comes in to endanger your life. So we have to, what you're doing then is you preemptively are protecting yourself and the world around you with your sense of restraint. That's why we practice. When we're practicing the 5 precepts, not to kill intentionally or harm other beings, not to take what is not given to us freely, not to engage in any sexual misconduct, taking someone else's mate, cheating on someone, engaging in any kind of sexual act with a minor, etc. Similar actions that are completely, misusing the body, harming someone, including yourself, sexually. The other one is lying, speaking falsehood, presenting things that are not real in order for you to get something out of it. Idle chatter, speaking about nonsense so that you can kill time and then wonder where that time went. Gossiping, backbiting, breaking people apart to fit your own schema of things. These are all the fourth, relating with the tongue, the speech, communication. It doesn't have to be just the tongue. I mean, you could do it via email even. And then lastly, using of intoxicants, all sorts of intoxicants. Anything that intoxicates creates a deluded state of mind. These are the 5 precepts that you are taking so that you protect yourself and, well, first of all, you protect yourself from any bad consequences of actions. Sometimes you might not notice this, but you might be eager to experience a certain emotion, but without having taken into consideration as to the impact it might have on some other people. So you pull back. You restrain. For example, as monastics, as Buddhist monastics, as a bhikkhu, for example, there are rules that I have to live by, including when I could go outside. So after a certain time, when it's sundown, I don't go outside. Especially if I find myself in a city or something like that, a place like that, I have to be secluding myself or restraining my presence, if you will. Restraining myself from being among lay people outside, on the streets, this and that. Meanwhile, in the daytime, it might not have been a problem. But at night, it would be. Because even if you're not doing anything, you're placing yourself in a situation that others might do things, and your presence there might complicate things or misconstrue, create misunderstandings, and eventually cause harm, at the very least, to someone, and usually you, and others in many cases. Now, that's just one example of how your restraint will cause there to be a harmonious state. So you're not complicating life. So when you see injustices in the world, when you see millions of people on the streets in places like the US or other places, that is an indicator, usually, of the times we're living in where people, human beings, have neglected to restrain themselves, restraining especially the sense of greed. For example, a landlord who's living fine with tenants who were paying their rent on time, and let's say it's a family of 4 or 5, but then they just randomly start saying, well, everything is getting more expensive, so I'm going to raise the rent by another 1,000. No, wait a minute, by 2,000. Well, how is this, family going to survive? You have this scenario. Not just in the US, I've seen this in Eastern Europe, I've seen this, a lot of people coming in from Ukraine and Russia and other places to other parts of the world, and all of a sudden, I've seen this in Bali, where people from Ukraine or other places had come there, and the locals were getting their tenants out of their own homes and giving the place out for rent to these other people, these foreigners who came in, for quintuple the price, sometimes 10 times. Well, what if the person can't afford it? Well, they go out. Where? Even if 4 or 5 of them are working, where do they go? What happened? What caused this? The person's greed. Because they were thinking, one person's greed somewhere. They wanted to, they had this notion. The same goes with someone, let's say, who has a one-bedroom apartment or a car or something they have, but now they're being exposed to the possibilities of having something even grander than that, a bigger of this, whatever it might be. And now their greed causes them to sacrifice their own joy and their time with their family, with their loved ones. So now they're going to have to work twice as much, go work, I don't know, as an Uber driver or something, on top of their normal 9-to-5 job, let's say, so that they can get this thing which they desire. Why? Because it gives them that feeling of hyperarousal. That's why so many people would go and work during the week, and then they would take their wages and they would go and gamble it away. 1 or 2 days, it would be gone. I knew individuals as I was growing up, like in my early 20s. I would work hard. I had friends around me, and they would work too. But instead of putting the money somewhere to build or to pay for something valuable, something important, they would go and just spend it away. And then they would have to start from scratch on Monday morning. Was the emotional promise of gratification, was it worth it? Now, for the person at that time, they have their memories of the weekend to justify that. And they would say, yes. Yes, of course. But then the thing that I was mentioning earlier, the reality of impermanence is completely neglected. This person is not going to be young all his or her own life. The body will not function as it did when they were 20. So again, restraining yourself is led by wisdom. For this reason, it has a huge place in the teachings of the Buddha. To be able to live your life with joy, with understanding that not every emotion that you experience is actually there for your own well-being or anyone else's. You have to put the clamps on it. You have to put a proper gauge on it. And that gauge is put into work with the help of discernment, understanding, wisdom. So the path of the Dhamma is not about extracting joy out of your life, making it dull and gray. No. This path is about happy people, not gloomy people. You don't see a gloomy Buddha, ever. If you do, then the sculptor actually didn't know what they were doing, or the painter didn't know what they were doing. Lord Buddha says this in the Dhammapada. While the rest of the world is in misery, we are the happy ones. Why? Because you understand the mechanism, the formula, the structure behind it all. You don't let your emotions guide you. You have your wisdom to look at the emotions, but then understand that they serve a purpose. Otherwise, emotions can be, you see this also in TCM, traditional Chinese medicine. Even joy, if it's too much, it's too rattly, it's too shaky, it creates turbulence in the heart and the mind. It's too much yang in the principle of yin and yang. It's too much yang. It's too agitated. There's too much fire there. It's highly provoked. There is no contentment in that sense. But when you have joy applied with wisdom, you have a better understanding and control to choose your path with the means and resources you have available to you. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult for you and those around you.